Good morning, Highlands, Presbyterian. So today, this is the last Sunday, really before we start entering the Advent season. So next Sunday, we've got Christ the King Sunday, and then Advent, first Sunday of Advent is after that. So really excited about getting into that season and the joy and the hope that comes with that. And so today, we're spending some time in one of my favorite verses in Scripture. And this one, I think, just really encapsulates the gospel. And it's from Zechariah chapter 3, verses 1 through 5. Then he showed me Joshua the high priest standing before the angel of the Lord, and Satan standing at his right hand to accuse him. And the Lord said to Satan, "The Lord rebuke you, O Satan. The Lord who has chosen Jerusalem rebuke you. Is not this a brand plucked from the fire?" Now Joshua was standing before the angel, clothed with filthy garments. And the angel said to those who were standing before him, "Remove the filthy garments from him." And to him he said, "Behold, I have taken your iniquity away from you, and I will clothe you with pure vestments." And I said, "Let them put a clean turban on his head." So they put a clean turban on his head and clothed him with garments, and the angel of the Lord was standing by. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So elections, right? Interesting times. As soon as the elections are over, which seems anymore whenever they get around to actually counting the votes, we get on to the next election. It's this exhausting process, but here we are, midterm elections, and it feels like they're already looking forward to the 2024 presidential election, right? And so in these discussions, people are trying to decide who is going to be the face of which party going forward, right? Who will be the most Republican person in 2024? Will it be Donald Trump? Will it be Ron DeSantis? Will it be somebody else? Who will be the most Democratic person? Will it be Joe Biden going for another run? Will it be somebody else, right? This is a big decision to make. But it's the person, right, who will most identify with the party. That person will bear the brunt if that party loses, or probably get the most credit if the party wins. And so it's a question, right? Who is it going to be who's positioning themselves to be that person? It happens in a lot of areas of life, right? If you think about sports, right? When Ohio State loses, talk radio blows up, and half the people calling in are calling in to complain about the coach, about the coach's decision makings, about the play calling. Even though the coach isn't the one out there actually executing the plays, people are calling in to criticize the coach because the coach most identifies with the team. It's been interesting watching the Blue Jackets at the beginning of hockey season, because they've been terrible. And so the question is, right, there's lots of people calling for the head coach to be fired. Is it the coach, or the players simply playing terrible? It seemed like he was a good coach last year. Did he forget how to coach? We don't know, but we all identify the problems of the team with the coach. Same thing happens in churches too. Right? The church identifies with the pastors. Can be good in many ways, but right, pastors are not perfect. Sometimes publicly not perfect. And so the pastor can do something to end up in the headlines, and then the reputation of the church, right, is tarnished along with it. And so we're thinking of Joshua in that lens today. Joshua is the high priest. And so Joshua is identifying with the people of Israel, right? And so when we look at Joshua, we look at what happens to Joshua, we should be thinking about the whole nation and what happens to the whole nation, what happens to the people of God. Because the story, it includes Joshua as a representative for all the people, but it's really a story about God and how God responds to people, even people who are guilty. And so when we think about, again, going through the stewardship season, we're talking about foundation. How do we set a firm foundation? I think this story is crucial to understanding how God relates to us, and therefore how we relate back to God. And so first, I just want to give you a little context into who Joshua is. And this is Joshua different than the Joshua who leads the Israelites into the promised land after the death of Moses. Joshua is different than the Joshua who takes the city of Jericho. So Joshua goes off into captivity in Babylon. And when the Jews return from Babylon, they start to build their houses before they start to build the temple. And so the prophet Haggai comes along and tells them about the importance of building the temple. And so they agree then that they're going to rebuild the temple. And Joshua's there in the midst of that process. And it reminds me of a story I heard a while back where they were talking about some of the earliest settlers, the Pilgrims in America. And so when they built a town, they built a church first, and then they built their houses. And then like the next generation built their houses and then built the church second. And their parents were convinced that this generation had completely lost it and that there was no hope for the next generation. I mean, these were people who went to church for 3 hours on a Sunday. And they were convinced that the generation had wandered far from God, which gives me a little comfort in thinking that this is just who we are as people. We always think the next generation is drifting away. And so, it's true then and true back in Israel. And so Haggai comes and calls the people to say, we got to build a temple, right, to organize our worship of God. And the temple needs a priest, right? And so Joshua is chosen as the first high priest once they've returned from captivity and they're building the temple. And so think about the kind of person Joshua would have been, right? He's probably a person of really high character. Doesn't seem to have any apparent flaws, right? He's not perfect, but he's probably one of, if not the best people in the entire community. And so he's the one, right? When we think of the holiest people in the community, he's probably the one that, or close to the top of the list of sort of the holiest people we'd make, the people who are the most blameless in society, the epitome of how people should be following God. And so with that understanding that Joshua is the one who, when we identify with who's doing things right in the nation of Israel at this time, Joshua would be probably that person, right? Just like the coach of a sports team, just like the head of a political party, Joshua would be the religious movement in Israel. He'd be the one we identify who, right, would get the glory when things go well and get the blame when things don't go well. And so then the vision in our reading today, right, Zechariah has this vision of Joshua standing before the Lord, and next to him is Satan, the accuser. And we say Satan is ready to accuse him. We don't know what exactly he's ready to accuse him of, but he's ready to accuse him. But before Satan can say a word, God cuts in with a rebuke. And now put yourself in Joshua's shoes. And it says Joshua's clothed in filthy garments, which is meant to symbolize the guilt. Maybe the guilt of Joshua, maybe the guilt of the people, but either way, right, if you're standing and you're clothed in filthy garments, right, you know it, right, you can't hide it. And so Joshua knows that he's guilty, right? He knows he's not perfect. And so he hears a rebuke start to come out of the Lord's mouth, right? How does he feel, right? He probably is terrified, feels guilty, right? He's ready to be accused, right? There's always something that we feel guilty of. I still remember when I was in college, so before the days of cell phone, it's 3 o'clock in the morning. Somebody's banging on my door. It turns out it's the police. And I will confess, my first thought was not, oh, they must have the wrong door. My first thought, right, was, oh no, what did they find out about? Turns out there was just a call. My mother had missed a plane, and this was before the days of cell phone. She was trying to get in touch with me. This was the way she had done it. Terrified me. If you think about a cat having 9 lives, that was one of mine. Right, because I felt guilty. I wasn't even sure what about, but I knew there were things I felt guilty about. And right, and I think that's probably how Joshua feels, and I imagine we've all felt that way in some way. We felt guilty for things we have done, right? Things that keep us up at night, things we wonder if God will hold against us, things we worry about being rebuked for. I've been in churches that use guilt as a motivator to get people to follow God, sort of get in line or else. But that's not the approach God takes here in Zechariah. It's not the approach we take here at Highlands. It's not what our theology is rooted in. Before Satan can say a word of accusation against Zechariah, God rebukes not Zechariah, God rebukes Satan. Right? Again, Joshua dressed in filthy rags. Right? The connotation here is that they're covered in excrement. Right? Not high fashion. right? They're filthy, not fit at all to be in the presence of a king. But God doesn't pile on and accuse Joshua. Instead, God gives an instruction to remove the filthy garments, regardless of whether or not the guilt is deserved. It's not even discussed. It's simply taken away. Right? Think about how you feel at this point. This is debt cancellation. Imagine you have a debt of someone for $50,000. It's completely canceled. You would celebrate this. You'd be thrilled. You'd owed a huge amount, and then you're debt free. But it gets even better than this. Right? Because not only are the excrement-covered rags, the guilt of Joshua, the guilt of the people taken away, the Lord commands pure garments, pure vestments to be put on Joshua. These are garments worthy to be worn in the presence of the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. Right? A clean turban or a pure diadem, depending on the translation, is put on Joshua's head. Even if his head isn't worthy of such a thing, it's this gift, this pure gift from God to Joshua, given out of grace, probably completely undeserved. Right? Joshua had this covered in filth, this lifetime of mistakes. His and his entire culture's, Satan's ready to pounce. They deserve accusation from God. But God, before anybody can say a word, God speaks a word of grace over Joshua. And it's not only taking away the guilt, but something more is given, these gifts of honor. Because of this, he's worthy to stand in the presence of God. Right? The 50,000, it's like 50,000 debt was canceled and somebody handed you that ticket, that winning ticket for the $2 billion Powerball. Right? Not only is the bad things taken away, glorious things are given. But it's better than the Powerball. Because the Powerball can't ultimately protect you from chaos and death, right? So many stories about lottery winnings just generating chaos in people's lives. God's gift of grace, right, is stronger than chaos, is stronger than death. And it will last forever. You can never spend it down. Right? This story perfectly encapsulates what Jesus Christ does for us on the cross. Right? Although we're covered in guilt, us and everybody around us, covered in filth, Jesus Christ takes that away before we can even ask, before we can come up with the words to beg for forgiveness. Jesus Christ takes it away. And in place of the guilt that we had, we receive the blessing and honor that he deserves. It's this tremendous free gift, and that's a foundation, right, worthy of building our lives upon. If we understand in our heart of hearts that our guilt has been taken away and something has been put there in its place that will stand forever, right, that transforms our lives. And so it's our prayers that we grasp that in our very depths. You know, for us, for every one of the kids, that we hold on to this reality, that our guilt and the guilt, right, of the community is taken away before we can say a word. And pure vestments are put on us, a clean turban on our head, that we may stand in the presence of God forever, that we are enough, that we are good enough because God has declared it so. And this is what enables Paul to be able to say, right, to pray that we are strengthened with all power according to God's glorious might for all endurance and patience with joy, giving thanks to the Father who has qualified you to share in the inheritance of the saints in light. This is what God is doing in Zechariah. He's qualifying Zechariah. He's qualifying the people to share in the inheritance. He delivered you from the domain of darkness and transferred us to the kingdom of his beloved Son, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins. Right? What if we lived out of that? What if we treated one another the same way, speaking words of grace and kindness before we got to the words of rebuke? Because we remember that we ourselves were once clothed in filthy garments. And though we deserved to be accused before God let the accuser speak, God spoke a word of love and power over us to transform us into a people worthy to stand in light and love forever. What an amazing story. Thanks be to God.